Boom. We have arrived. Let's give it a few moments so that we can be sure that our audio connectivity is rolling. Let me check the other side over here. Looks like it's going. Yes. We are operational. Greetings, everyone. Yes, I am very, very aware for those of you guys finding this recording either in the now moment or after it has aired. Yeah, it seems like everybody in the world is online now every time, afternoons around this time, which is good, which is good. It's also at times maybe not the best time to do this. We might experiment with different hours of operation in the coming months, but I want to say thank you to everyone that is here, everyone that is streaming in. I think we're operational, but let me know if the audio is working. Well, to be honest with you, I know it's working because I kind of checked. I checked on YouTube, but cool. We got a 5-5 in the chat. What about 6-7? You know what I mean? Isn't that I don't even know what it means. Never mind. But thank you, everyone. Here we are. It is Wednesday, February 11th. And here in the third to fourth density space-time continuum, we find ourselves still locked in physical human containers. And the flow of energy is it's just increasing. And I know that sounds kind of cheesy and, new agey to start out with, but we did just have very significant solar flare, lots of changes afoot on the Earth plane. And I don't know, man, not that I ever call it, because every now and then I do call it, but some people out there, well, it doesn't really matter, probably nobody out there, but for those that were willing to look back on some of our previous broadcasts, you may have noticed we called this one. We definitely called this one. I think the first 2 months of 2026 have shown us beyond the shadow of a doubt that this is going to be a very turbulent year. Maybe we're entering the building fire of the fire horse, coming in around, was it 17th? And so, there's been lot of things that have fallen away, I would say, over the past couple of weeks, right? All kinds of stuff, things from your lives, relationships, just turning points have occurred with such shocking regularity that it's just wild, especially when I see the people that have been coming in and booking sessions with me. It's very, very, man, yeah, this is a firmly packed, highly turbulent period of just increased flow of some kind of energy, whether it be awareness, whether it be anxiety inducing, whether it be a time of despair. For some people out there that I think, which is normal at certain times, they may get overwhelmed by the amount of disturbing so-called disclosures that we see with Epstein related things, and just all of the wildness of our current world. It's get ready, you guys know what I'm going to say. It's the best time we could have chosen to be alive. And anyway, thank you for joining us, everyone. Thank you for being here wherever you are in the world. Whoa. Instead of 6-7, we got 6-9. If it was what? If it was like 1993, then we're like, yeah, right? I feel like in 1993, 6-9 was 6-7 for people that are here now, right? Does that make sense? Probably not. But Girl and her gong says, I don't 6-7. I don't even know. I don't know what that means. I just, you know what I mean? I'm like grabbing onto something present, within the energy of the moment and swinging it around like I have knowledge of it, and I don't. But anyway, thank you for being here, you guys. We're going to get started rather quickly today. We're not going to draw this out with a lot of ranting and raving. What's up, Cosmic Kitten? Thank you for showing up. What's going on, Heidi Pop LA? Maybe it's going to change to Heidi Pop WI. Is it going to change to that? Heidi Pop Wisconsin? Maybe you should. Then again, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe you should stay as the Heidi Pop LA version of yourself. Well, regardless of whatever version of ourselves we are in right now, seriously, regardless of whatever version of you currently are right now, over the coming, let's say, 60 to 90 days. I'll give it a generous chunk of time. Get ready for a new trajectory. Get ready for some new things walking in the door. Get ready for a definitive new chapter in certain areas of your life, whether it be relationship, whether it be work. Well, it's going to be for a lot of people more, we could call it spiritually related if you're within that sort of soul group of people who are kind of involved in those things. And let's just say if you're not, and I think most people are on some level, whether they realize it or not. But for those that are still very, very also within the regularity of the third density world, which some would argue is almost more important because we need to sort of fortify our relationship with the physical realm as we're here. I know a lot of people seek to do otherwise, right? We've spoken of this many times. Everyone's trying to leave Earth. Everyone's trying to get out of here, right? Everyone's trying to never incarnate here again. But I don't know, man. The Earth mission is the greatest one. And so, anyways, the reason why I'm going on about this at the beginning of our talk today is because just get ready for a bit of a shift in that vein, as we hit the so-called beginning of this official kind of fire horse year, this movement or this path of energy. It's going to change for a lot of us. I wouldn't say it's like we're going to take like a 90-degree turn or go all the way back from where we came, but just get ready for a whole bunch of different layers of something to be added into your daily experience. And I think for a lot of us, that's going to necessitate a higher level of awareness of truth, which comes through many different ways. But anyway, before I rant on and on, what's up, girl? Energon? Better days are coming. Totally, right? I hope so. Then again, I'm going to be real with you. I think 2026 gives us a lot of really turbulent days, especially as we get closer to the summer. And I feel like something wild is going to get dropped right around the first week of March. Somewhere in the next 30 days, we're going to get another set piece that's going to completely eclipse the other ones that we had. And I think that's necessary right now for some of the powers that are trying to take control in different ways. You know what I mean? Anyway, I don't want to get into that because that's we're going to do another live in the coming days and talk more about the randomness. But anyway, thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. What's up? Roy Diamondheart. Every time I hear the word fire horse, it makes me hear the song Thunder Horse from Guitar. Whoa. You know what? I'm sorry to admit this. I missed out on the Guitar Hero rock band trend, that phase of music, that phase of like video games. I fully missed out on that one. And I think mainly it was because during the time in which that was really big and cool, I was actually playing in a real band. And for some reason, like I was always like, that shit's not, you know what I mean? I was very quick to like, to be like, that's so lame. But then I actually ended up playing it a couple of years later, and I was like, this is actually really fun. I was totally into it later on, but during the trend phase, I was like, yeah, whatever. I'll play a real guitar. Screw that. You know what I mean? How we put ourselves in that, like, but like later on, I was like, damn, I should have been playing this. Damn, why did I think it was lame? You know what I mean? But now it's like, I guess that stage is over. Yeah, totally. Yeah, a lot of people did. A lot of people did. I had caught on later after it was already lame. For everyone else passed it by, and I was like, okay, I'll try. Yeah, anyway, it got pretty weird for a while. Like I guess I had roommates at the time, and I remember like they got like there was like a drum set, that came that you could buy. There was like all of like the instrumentation, and I remember like ridiculing everybody about it. And then like later on, I was like, damn, it was so cool. But anyway, nowadays I'm just kind of caught up in no, probably literally nobody that watches this channel will know this, but I've completely lost myself to Arc Raiders, who I think, which is honestly one of the only games that's really, really grabbed me since Elden Ring. Elden Ring was one that I played like multiple playthroughs, and there's the whole other side of my like normal daily human life is first we have like this work that we do, and then there's like the downtime where I have like literally nothing left to do but play video games. So some of you guys will cringe at that, but that's how it is. And so anyway, Firebird, I could play Freebird. Man, I could say so much about that. I actually, yeah, anyway, we will table that for another conversation. But anyway, before we get started, let me know if anybody has any questions. For those of you guys that don't know, the reason why we are here is we are working our way through this lengthy body of work released in June, on June 22nd, 2024. And today we're venturing into, honestly, some of the really fun parts of this book, the parts that I greatly enjoyed writing. Some of you guys already know this, but the reality is the entire project was ultimately some form of like a self-therapy project in which I just needed to sort of like regurgitate out all of these experiences that I had been through on the path toward becoming, this stage in my life, which is funny because this stage is about to evolve into something else in the coming weeks and months. But so there's sort of a full circle, like coming back in a certain sense as we go through these stories. But what we're going to be getting into today, and this is for those of you guys that are following along, we're going to be on page 185, and we're going to dive into what I believe, like I said, these are the funnest. To me, it's funny to look back on this stage of my life and doing what I do, because during the experiencing of it, it was probably one of the most, well, it was a beautiful period. It was a difficult period. It was a rageful period. It was highly frustrating. It was a time of life in which so many new things came in every single day that there was very little time to adjust or to sort of sit with anything, or to, we could even say, allow certain things to integrate within the self. It was like every day, one after another, there was just these unbelievable events and just all kinds of stuff. And so a lot of that took place at the store that I was working at during that time of my life. And it was, the only, I guess we could say, psychic shop that I've ever worked at. I'm not saying it'll be the only one. I don't know that I would ever return to that environment. I might, but I don't know. Then again, at the same time, it's also a thing where you will be very aware of the fact that you don't need to. You know what I mean? Which I think is a blessing. You know what I mean? The work that I do at this stage of the journey does not necessitate being, physically present in a storefront. And however, at the same time, there's so much learning and experience and different types of frequencies that are held by people, places, things, spiritual energies that can come walking in the door, that I think it is also one of the most amazing opportunities for those that do this work. And one thing I can say is that working at this shop fundamentally changed me. It changed the course of my life. It changed the way I use psychic abilities. It changed the way I teach these things now. It even branches into what I will get into in the future, and that is understanding the ethics and the procedures and the mannerisms around what makes us successful as a professional intuitive or a professional psychic, and how do we bring those energies into our life without falling prey to the many temptations and even the darkness that comes your way along the path, because it's very, very real. And there are so many wild people that I came in contact with that I still do, only now it's over Zoom. And we could say that even in the still doing of it now, I mean, even crazier things happen later. But I think the fun part about the chapter that we're getting into today is that it was at the stage where it was all new and it was all real and it was right in your face and it was happening now in the moment. And it was like you could only react and respond based upon the tools that were available. And it's funny because looking back, as we often do with such things, I think I reacted and responded pretty well to a lot of the bullshit that I had to deal with, and also a lot of the realness that I had to deal with. And anyway, before I rant on and on, we shall begin. Yeah, Girl Energonk says PlayStation 2, totally. That was a hell of an era. PlayStation 2 was a fun era. So Shady Pop says, I've said it, but say it again. Thank you for actually writing the book. So many pump out AI books with no soul. I fully agree with that, Heidi. I've been made aware of them. I've seen them. I've read snippets of their work. I'm not saying nothing good can come out of it, but I'll just be totally honest with you. If you're using artificial intelligence to write the majority of your spiritual messages at this point, even if it's your autobiography, I'll just be real. I don't really have respect for those people. I'm not saying I don't respect you entirely as a person. I'm just saying, like, I don't have respect for that process of creation. And it's hard because there's so much cool stuff can come out of it now, but it's just like, I mean, I think everybody can tell Chat GPT scripting language when you read it. And when somebody gives you a book of it, of like 200 pages of Chat GPT scripting through the spiritual kind of filter that it has, the new age spiritual starseed filter, it just, you can feel it and you can tell that it's not real. And I think that's one of the areas where AI is still having a really hard time living up to the standards of emotional transference and thought form based communication that comes with real organic writing. You know what I mean? And for anyone that looks at my book, they'll be like, dude, there's so many typos in it. Of course he wrote it, right? Because there are. It's kind of how it is. But anyway, yeah, I've just never been into anybody that does the AI book thing. I'm sorry if some of the AI book people watch this. I don't know, just whatever. Anyway, so we're going to begin. We're going to dive back into this strange process here. And I'm going to light some incense over here because that was one thing I was meaning to do before we started. And so there it goes. Okay. I don't see any questions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Robin Lane, by the way. Thank you for sending this book to your niece. Very, very cool. Thank you. I sincerely appreciate that. Here we go. What's up, Andromeda? I'm tired of helping. I've helped in many incarnations of here and off world. I feel you on that, man. That might continue. But just remember, it's always a choice. It's always a choice. And so, anyway, all right, guys, we're going to pick it up from page 185. This is the chapter entitled The Liberation Files. For those who don't know, the real name of this store is called Liberate. You can look it up right now online, owned by the same people. Some of the people that I'm about to talk about in this chapter still work there. They'll be there for the rest of their life. Which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but you know what I mean? For some people, it's as good as it's going to get. Some people will hear me say that and they'll be like, "Oh, that's not very well, Matthew." And you'll understand why later on. But anyway, so we're going to begin from page 185. This is the chapter entitled The Liberation Files. One of the most intense entity clearings I have ever facilitated happened in the first year of my tour of duty as a professional psychic and energetic practitioner. In early 2018, I was summoned by the owner of the shop I worked at to help with a situation that was taking place at her other location, a huge retail, spiritual store, and supposed healing center, quote unquote, right in the heart of Hollywood, known as Revolution Hollywood. That wasn't its real name. I'll just because now the name is out. It was called Liberate Hollywood. I don't think that store is still open, but it was like right next to it was like Hollywood and Vine or somewhere like a block or two. The heart of just like cesspool Hollywood. You know what I mean? It was like right there, right in the middle of it. And so I'll call it by its real name now, Liberate Hollywood. The store had been remodeled from an old recording studio into what it was now, a sprawling two-story retail space with a massive crystal store on the ground floor, and then a series of reading and healing rooms on the second floor. Each room upstairs, get this, you guys, had been named after various ascended masters and archangels. I think they had a room for all of the main archangels, Archangel Michael room, Archangel Gabriel, and Raphael, you know what I mean? And it was like you had the archangel rooms, and then you had some ascended masters rooms. In truth, I don't remember the specific names, but I do recall there being a Shiva room, a Haruman room, and even something like a Babaji room. On the walls inside the rooms were painted these elaborately stylized sigils and spiritual symbols. Some were chakras, like if you look up clip art for like chakras and whatnot, you'll get these sort of mandala looking kind of images that are in many cases actually symbolic of, the frequency of the chakra. But some of the symbols on the walls were chakras. Some were actual sigils, like that I did not understand their purpose of, and honestly didn't really feel a lot of energy coming from them. Just to be real, it was just like a thing where like, oh, I see you're doing some sigil magic there, creating your own symbols, and then you kind of feel into it, and you're like, anyway, you know what I mean? You kind of pay attention for a second. But it was highly, highly stylized, very, very 2018, like the pinnacle of like Hollywood spirituality and, like galactic shamanism 2018. It was like, oh, it was like a most perfect example of it. And so there was these sigils and symbols on the wall. Some were actual sigils and some were just random spiritual insignias that had no real relevance as far as I could tell. To tell you the truth, it felt like one of the fakest and most toxic environments I have ever encountered. I had been offered to take a number of shifts and do classes there several times, but up until that day, I had actively avoided it like the plague. And I'll pause there to say that is 100% real. I was offered to get hours at the store many, many times, and everybody that worked at the little dirty store that I was at was always like, I want to go work at the Hollywood store. Everyone had this idea that it was so cool and it was so plugged in and so connected, and it was just one of those places, man, where like the very first time I went in there, I was like, okay, you know what I mean, where you can feel the portrayal. You can see, like you see it dressed up just like Jesus, and then you get close to him and you realize he's smoking a cigarette and he looks like he's on meth for like the last 3 days, and you're like, oh, hmm, okay. You know what I mean? You look a little closer and it's like, no, 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 I do not want that. And so I actively avoided it like the plague. It just felt dirty and fake and hostile. And I didn't see why anyone wanted to, I didn't see why everyone wanted to be there. There was this ultra toxic spirit of competition and posturing that you'll often see with practitioners and psychics that are stuck in a stage of early development. Everything's about presentation, language, and the appearance of what they have been taught to be real but have not yet experienced. The people that worked there felt like characters in a reality TV show, and it was just so painfully obvious how everyone was merely portraying what they had seen in movies and television. It was like an embarrassing spiritual role playing game. You had the cosmic priestesses, we had a bunch of those. The galactic shaman, that was actually the first time I heard of a galactic shaman, was there. Even a few traditional witches and a couple overly effeminate male tantric masters. Those were the best ones. I'm a tantric master, and there's like this look like, and you're like, yeah, yeah, you are, aren't you? And so it was just that environment where it's like every phrase comes with a posture. Every posture is meant to portray a certain feeling or to sort of hook you in their character development arc. And so, there we had the galactic shaman, the traditional witches, the tantric masters who felt like they had just been fired off the set of some teen movie soundstage only blocks away. I mean, seriously, it was like, bro, you just walked off the set wearing that, didn't you? And now you're at work. Congratulations. In hindsight, I think you could call it more of a spiritual performance center rather than a healing space of any kind. Later on, I learned of the supposed sex rituals the owner Christina had engaged in with her employees and practitioners. It was very openly talked about, and although I had never witnessed any of that there, I was shocked during the first ever group meditation I held there months later to find this is gross. This is real life. Okay, you guys, I'm gonna set up this next statement by saying this was, I think, in the afternoon. It was afternoon meditation, and somebody canceled. And they're like, Matthew, please come over and just do the meditation that you do on Thursday nights. Come over and do it in the afternoon. And I was like, okay, you know what I mean. I was just like, all right, let's go do it. And you know, While I had never witnessed anything that went on, a few months later, I went there to do a meditation and I found a, get ready, a still wet and glistening used condom behind the PA system as I was looking for a microphone. It was one of those moments where you're like, wait, what? You know, and you're like, no, nobody, nobody knows that's there. And honestly, you guys, I just left it and I was like, okay, and you just kind of go on, you know what I mean? I was like, "Let's keep rolling." And so there was this literally a condom laying there behind the PA system as I was looking for a microphone. It's hilarious and gross to think about, but at the time, I just looked at it for a few seconds and left it there. No one could have seen it other than the employees, which told me exactly where it had originated. That itself should tell you everything one would need to know about that place. But on the surface, it was like this ultra cool, spiritually advanced center for supposedly real psychics and practitioners of spirit to build themselves even into even more powerful and attuned masters of some kind of cosmic false light bullshit that most people who had never known the real thing would instantly take as genuine, despite all the visible cracks and festering parasitic energy just under the surface. You know what I mean? It's almost like, just like I said, like that moment where you see the Jesus impersonator dude wearing the robe and you get up close to him and you're like, whoa, hey. And you see like they just look like shit. You know what I mean? And it's just like, whoa. It was that sort of a place where it was like everything had sort of like a shine, but it also had a weird distorted film underneath it. You know what I mean? But at the same time, it was glistening and perfect. And just as a little other little chunk of data, I recall hearing that the owner had spent something like just a exorbitant amount of money. I think it was like 50,000 or more to create a type of flooring for their store that was infused with all of these crystals, and they had hired these people to sort of put this some sort of acrylic sealant over all these crystals that had been embedded into the floor. And what's wild is it didn't work, and it was just like this weird sort of hard, slippery, lumpy kind of like acrylic flooring that was underneath. And it was just like everything about it was like, wow, you even put the crystals in the flooring, didn't you? You know, it's like so spiritual. you know but at the same time, it's like, I would go in there and, they will just look at you like, "And who are you here to see?" That, like, instant wave of toxicity and, like, evaluation, and it's not to say that the customers got that, it was only the people that work there toward each other. Probably one of the most hostile environments I had ever been in, and yet at the same time, it wasn't like that at the other store that I worked. It was much more just there's a lot more cohesiveness, a lot less portrayal. Anyway, to get back to the text here, the original location had been supposedly made famous by recording artists like Jimi Hendrix and the Pixies, or at least that was the story. Apparently, Jimi Hendrix recorded one of his albums there, or part of it. You know, how there's always like a rock star story attached to every single, one of these Hollywood places, or at least that was the story. One entire side of the second floor contained a huge recording studio that had been preserved over the years, and the owner was spending tens of thousands of dollars a month on renovations, remodeling, and a lot more. There was a studio apartment in the back to allow some of the more dedicated employees to have a place to stay should it be needed. They even had showers and a mini TV and a mini TV studio tucked in there somehow. I mean, really, they had a whole somehow they had created a literal broadcasting center inside this spiritual store. And they really did, and is no exaggeration. I mean, they pumped so much money into this. It was crazy. They had everything they needed. It was really that huge. Supposedly, even Frank Black of the Pixies had lived there for a short time decades earlier. But once again, I mean, honestly, that was only hearsay. You know what I mean? Stories that they tell about a place. It was a place that had seen a lot of history over the years, and you could certainly feel it when you went in there. Only it seemed to have become corrupted in some way. Who knows? Maybe it had always been like that. There were constant issues with employees, negative customers, even a series of lawsuits that had been leveled against the owner at the time for shady business practices that were all in varying stages of development. And honestly, it was well known. It was one of the most talked about kind of, backroom discussions about that place. It was everything from sex rituals to drinking each other's blood to the fact that she was in like 4 or 5 different lawsuits all at the same time. Like, I mean, if there were ever the signs of like total chaotic hijacking or interference in someone's life, I mean, it was like everywhere. Everything good turned into drama, and very rarely did anything that was born of drama turn into anything at all. And yet, within the midst of it, there were a few very good people that worked there. It's just what you find in places like that. The real people, the good people, the ones with integrity, the ones with talent are often eclipsed by their performers. And as a result, they don't stay. You know what I mean? I didn't stay. I was actually forced to leave, but which is a whole other conversation. But getting back to the story here, one day in particular, I had just arrived at the other location in Los Feliz, where I had spent 90% of the time while working there. It had its share of issues, but it felt far less parasitic. Maybe it was a bit more dysfunctional in its own way, but also a lot weirder. I remember sitting there just hanging out, and the owner, Christina, came in visibly distressed. And to give you guys a mental picture of this, there was a very narrow hallway at the back right corner of this spiritual shop. And that narrow hallway had a little thin bench on it and, like a microwave, stuff like that, where people would make coffee, a backroom vibe. And there was just this bench, this kind of row bench that was in the back hallway where people that work there would just pause and hang out and stand around and everybody would talk. And, like the water cooler, the coffee machine thing from, office life. You know what I mean? It was one of those similar sort of, places where people will kind of stop. And so anyway, getting back to it. One day in particular, I had just arrived at the other location in Los Feliz, where I had spent 90% of time while working there. It had its share of issues, but it felt far less parasitic. Maybe it was a bit more dysfunctional in its own way, but also a lot weirder. I remember sitting there just hanging out, and the owner, Christina, came in visibly distressed. She immediately stormed into one of the reading rooms in the back and slammed the door. And now, before I go on to the next part, she came pretty much running in the door, like, like kind of in a huff, where someone opens the door and they just go, and they just go right through. They don't say anything to everyone. They kind of push their way through a group of people and go into a room and slam the door behind them. And everyone was like, whoa, okay. That moment where you're like, damn, something's going on. No words, just came in like looking frantic as hell and slammed the door. And within a few minutes, a small Asian looking woman came in wearing this all black, ridiculously theatrical outfit. It looked exactly like what a Victorian era witch would wear, or at least that's what I thought of when I saw her. She was holding a black wired birdcage in her right hand, and inside the cage was a small black cat that looked absolutely miserable. It was like a kitten. This little kitten was inside a black birdcage. The woman had a strange scowl on her face. I mean, for real, she came in looking like just with hatred. When you see people with hatred on their face, it was the face that was like, "Don't talk to me, don't look at me," type of a vibe, right? The woman had a strange scowl on her face, and I tried to lighten things up by jokingly remarking, this is really what I said to her. I looked at this woman that walked up to those benches, and I said, "Is that your familiar?" And for those of you guys that don't know, a familiar is an old world term that describes an animal servant of a witch or a warlock. They're often cats, birds, rodents, etc. I'm literally wearing an Adopt a Familiar shirt today because we were going to talk about this chapter. But there I was. The owner comes barging in, slams this door, and I think there's a couple women standing there with me as well. And this little short lady comes in with this scowl on her face, very angry, like angry Chinese vibe, you know what I mean? Carrying literally a black bird cage with a little cat inside it. Imagine what kind of a spectacle that is. And you know me in my sarcastic way, I'm like, is that your familiar? And the woman turned and looked at me over her shoulder as she walked down the hall with one of the most hateful glances I had received in years. I mean, it was so obvious that everyone that was standing there was like, oh, damn." You know that moment where you're like, "Let's just go." You know what I mean? That sort of moment where you can just tell something's about to pop off. Someone's gonna talk some shit, you know what I mean? It was one of the most hateful glances I had received in years. She entered the room in which the owner had just hurried into. And within a few moments after that, everyone outside could hear sounds of what can only be described as a physical beating. You could literally hear the smack of hands and thrashing, grunting, things falling on the floor, and then a series of garbled phases that seemed too sudden and involuntary to be fake in any way. And I mean, it was unbelievable. This little woman goes in the door, and you hear in the background this sound like, you know, like literally the smack of somebody, and like this, you know, you could hear like a glass fall, or you know, some like a table get knocked. You know, everyone was like, "Oh," you know, like what? You know, everyone's just sitting there listening to it, right? And so there was some physical beating, and I wish I knew what was said, but it was so sudden, it was explosive. I mean, nobody in their right mind would go, "Are they just performing?" No, I mean, it was like straight up. There was some shit going down between these 2 women, and it devolved into a physical fight inside one of the reading rooms. And so we all just sat there, myself and 2 to 3 other readers, and just listened in silent awe as we heard some kind of a beat down going on in the other room. I remember one of the girls who had worked in the front of the store making a joke about it, but I don't remember what it was. Regardless, it seemed routine for what they had come to expect of the owner and those she was connected with. In hindsight, it was like a scene from a movie, and as twisted as it sounds, it was actually quite entertaining to take all that in while at work. I'll be real. I actually enjoyed it. It was funny. It was chaotic and like, "Oh my God." You know those moments where you're like, "Oh shit." You just like everything's falling apart. People are fighting and you're like not involved in any of it. And you're just like watching it go by. You know what I mean? I wish I could have recorded it. Didn't even think to at the time. But when it came to the work I did there, or learned to do rather, as in truth, I probably had even less experience than many of the so called pretenders I passed judgment on. Things were often even stranger in ways I could have never anticipated. One morning, I had just shown up for work around 10 a.m. and sat in my dingy little reading room drinking coffee when Christina came in and recruited myself and another practitioner, an older black lady by the name of Reverend Maureen, to go with her over to the Revolution Hollywood location. That's the other store in Hollywood, and help perform an exorcism on the building. Yes, exorcism. That was the specific word. And it wasn't like, "Matthew, will you?" It was like, "Matthew, Maureen, come on. We're going over to Liberate Hollywood. We're gonna do an exorcism." And I was like, "Okay." You know what I mean? Instantly I was like, "Yeah, all right." But I also realized looking back, you know, it was because I wanted to be of service. I wanted to go there. I wanted to be asked. I wanted to, even if it was chaotic, even if it wasn't what they said it was. I was overjoyed by being asked to be of service at that stage. Not to say that it always went the way I hoped. It certainly didn't, but so she came over and said, "I'm recruiting you guys to do an exorcism on the building." She claimed there was a lot of negative entity activity there, disembodied spirits, and all kinds of chaos that had been going down for months. Given what I had seen and learned about that place so far, it was no surprise, but of course I agreed to go. It's not like I could have said no in all reality. As crazy and gross and sickening as I could tell she was, I still carried the wound of needing to be liked. And so I willingly agreed to help in whatever way I could. Even if I had never done anything like an exorcism and had no idea how, it felt like something I was willing to be a part of, even if just because I wanted to feel needed in some way. And I think at many stages that's a wound that a lot of us within, if you want to call it a spiritual community, or those of us that kind of digest the subject matter that we're speaking about here, you know what I mean? A lot of us carry that wound of wanting to be wanted. You know what I mean? We want to be sought after. We want to be, sometimes we don't know why, but that was a stage of my life where I was like, oh, really? You want me to do this? Okay, I'll do it. Even though I have no idea how. And so it was like I was actually grateful to be there. It was the first time in my entire life I had experienced any kind of personal success whatsoever. And I felt a sense of purpose for the first time. And, I have to say that again, working at that shop in the first 2 years of my journey in doing this work and all the way up until today, it's funny to admit it. For some people, it's sad to admit it. For some people, it's just real. But I had never had any kind of true success in this entire life cycle until I began doing this work. I was blessed to play in a band for a lot of years. I was blessed to receive, even local music awards at the time, a couple of them. You know what I mean? I was blessed to be able to go on tour. I was blessed to be able to do, to make albums with people. And that was a really amazing period of my life. But I'll be real, I was consciously aware of how it had never actually led to anything. And I was consciously aware of something that I was doing more as a labor of love rather than something that the world ever recognized. And, I know that's the norm for so many of us in this world, but, you know, it's just funny to note that only when I began doing this work was the first time in my entire human life in which I've experienced any type of success. And so anyway, I kind of jumped a little bit ahead. I'm going to reread that. We ended up taking separate cars. We split up into our own separate cars over there. And along the way, as I was driving, maybe it was about a 15-minute drive from Los Feliz to Hollywood at that time of day. It was pretty short. But along the way, I remember doing a very sincere prayer, thanking all those who had been helping me in some way since getting started in that strange realm. It's not that I knew why, but I felt it was needed. And in truth, I was actually grateful to be there. It was the first time in my entire life I had experienced any kind of personal success whatsoever. And I felt a deep sense of purpose for the first time. Despite how radically inexperienced I was at that time, no one knew. And it was a great confirmation to see how the work I was doing had already been seen by those there as remarkably effective. Upon arriving, Reverend Maureen and I were led up to the second floor by Christina and made to wait in the green room of the recording studio that had been part of the original construction of the building. Reverend Maureen was one of the most intriguing spiritual performers, quote unquote, I have ever laid eyes on. Everything she did was like a show in some way, and I don't necessarily mean that in a good way. It was painfully obvious to me how diluted she was in her craft. It was like pure surface level, lukewarm, vanilla psychic energy, the kind that can only repeat to you in different words what you had just said to her minutes earlier, but she could do it with enough flair and theatrical display of a 1990s era telephone call-in psychic that those who had never seen a real one would immediately accept as truly competent professionalism. Now, I'm not saying she was entirely fake. I had received a couple readings from her while there, and they were pretty on point in a general way. Despite lacking in anything truly deep or relevant, she could at least read the energy of a situation, and I will give her that much. I remember Maureen saying she felt like the place had been inhabited by a demonic energy, and after a few moments, she grabbed some sage from her purse and started prancing around the second floor, waving lit sage around as if she actually thought it would clear out whatever demonic energy she believed was there. She had a lot of sayings and phrases you could tell she had used for years. My favorite one was a literal phrase that this woman would use. She would say, "I'm gonna." She my favorite phrase she would use was one about dropping 1,000 orbs of light into a space, which in her mind apparently did something to clear energy. And I'm telling you, this was like a calling card of this woman. Something would go down and she'd be like, "That's it. I'm dropping 1,000 orbs of light on you right now. I'm dropping 1,000 orbs of light, 1,000 orbs of light," just like this, "Here comes 1,000 orbs of light." And it was like, this highly performative, yet I will say cathartic in a sense, you know what I mean? And she had the ability to grab people with that type of, theatrics that I think for some people that sort of person works very, very well. And so, there we were on the second floor and she's waving around with this, sage dancing around, dropping 1,000 orbs of light on everyone and everything. And for the record, it is my personal experience that burning sage and Palo Santo are not very effective ways of ridding a space of truly negative energy. I guess I'll read that again for anyone that needs to hear it. For the record, it is my personal experience that burning sage and Palo Santo are not very effective ways of ridding a space of truly negative energy. While it will create a lightening of energy in a physical space and can even somewhat sanitize an area on a spiritual level, it will do absolutely nothing to what we might call fully formed sentient spiritual entities. While they don't like it and may even change their behavior or pull back until the smoke clears, they will nearly always return as soon as the smell goes away. I've lived this, I've seen it, I've experienced it time and time and time and time again. Don't ever confuse burning sage as energy clearing that yields final results. It's going to be more for the beholder, and it's going to be more for setting and changing and sort of centering or grounding the vibe in the room more than it is toward banishing anything. And I hold firm to that understanding um, until I see evidence to the otherwise. Not to say don't use them. I say use them as much as you can, as much as you absolutely believe in it. And so, while I'm willing to be wrong, I believe this is a literal fact, and I've seen it time after time. Think of it more like a spiritual air freshener that merely covers up a negative energy for a time. But if you don't address the source, it'll just start stinking again in no time at all. It's more effective as a calming agent and a pacifier for humans than anything else. But don't get me wrong, I burn sage and Palo Santo constantly. Well, I don't have any right now, but I mean, all the time. So I'm not saying don't. I'm not saying don't engage in it. I'm just saying understand what it can do and what it can't do. I think it can very effectively at times create a lightening of the energy in the room. But if there's real negativity there, just like a real evil person, you can blow smoke in their face and they'll be like, you know what I mean? But if they're still there to do harm, they're going to do harm whether you blow smoke in their face or not. And so, just use it with awareness. I see them as part of a spiritual process of setting a sacred space and priming energy for the practitioner or whoever's using them, rather than a truly effective deterrent for negative spiritual forms. In fact, given what I was about to experience in that place, this was one time in which that would be made painfully obvious to everyone who was there. After Maureen pranced around the second floor doing her oddly captivating performative process of banishing, it looked like my turn came up. Christina suddenly ran to the back of the building and brought one of her maintenance workers into the green room. He was a white guy with 1980s style puffy hair that looked matted and greasy. He seemed to be in his early 50s at the most, and looked like one of those people who had been born and raised in some kind of subhuman trailer park realm and then suddenly ran away to the big city on a false dream of stardom decades ago. He had pock marks on his face that looked like the kind long-term meth addicts get after years of manic skin picking, and he smelled like cigarettes and old beer. I mean, for real, no exaggeration. It was like this dude walked in the room, and it was like he was still in 1980 or 1978. Like, you know that look of people where you're like, "Damn, you still got the hairstyle. Somehow you're still wearing jeans that are like 70s, but not really." You know what I mean? Like, you maintain that vibe so well that it's both kind of cringe and also like, "Whoa, you kept it up." But not for good reasons. You know what I mean? Like, they did not maintain their personal sense of style and presentation because it was dear to them. It was almost like a case of arrested development where somebody had stopped growing and they were just sort of stuck in this certain stage. And he did not look good. I cannot stress how sick and weird this guy looked. Um, which, no, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing given what was about to happen. It was just, as you notice people that come in, you're like, "Ooh, damn, oh, all right, what's up?" My initial thought of him when he came in the room, which is good to be able to talk about this here before I get back to the text. My first initial vibe from him was just pure alcoholism. Like the look on the face, it was like that leathery kind of darkness, not dark darkness, but the skin turns sort of, you know, becomes darkened after a time, that sort of leathery, toxified look on the face. That was my first vibe, was like, "Oh man, bro, you're in real bad alcoholism now, bro." You could just see it. Anyway, and so let me get back to it here. So he had pock marks on his face, a lot of kind of acne, stuff that looked like a long-term meth addict. She told me he had been living in the back apartment during the renovation and had been possessed by some kind of entity. An actual possession? I was highly intrigued, but also felt completely out of my element. Still, I must admit, I didn't believe her. The guy ca Well, before I get on to that, I mean, I really didn't. I'm not saying that I didn't believe that these things were real. It was just the guy that walked in the room was, like I said, I'm like, "Bro, you just need to quit drinking, man. We need to get you into a program." You know what I mean? You'll go into this program for a while. Things will get better, just that type of thing. You just need treatment, buddy. That was my first thought about this guy. And so let me get back to it. The guy came in and sat down on a little brown ottoman cushion in the corner of the room. We'll call him Jared, but in truth, I do not remember his name at all. I really don't. I don't know what this guy's name was. It was something with a J. Could have been Jason. I don't know. I'll just call him Jared. Reverend Maureen had just re-entered the room, still holding her smoldering sage bundle, and waved it around his head like she was baptizing him in some strange way. I think she invoked the name of Archangel Michael or something along those lines. While I do not call in archangels in my own sessions or spiritual work, I realize many rely on that identity as some kind of a savior or a protector, or, we could say a spiritual entity that one can call upon for protection or assistance. The truth is, for those that know, Archangel Michael seems to be one of the most commonly faked spiritual presences of all time. In fact, many non physical beings of earthbound or lower density will often identify themselves as Archangel Michael to people with low discernment, because as soon as many of us hear that name, they tend to feel at ease and open themselves up, right? Right? As soon as you hear that phrase echo through your mind and your heart and your body in that moment of spiritual connectivity, and it's Archangel Michael, most people are like, yes, you know what I mean? There's like this, whatever you say, type of a vibe. And I've seen that for years. I'd seen that for years. I've seen people do it. I still see people do it now. I have people that book sessions with me. I've had recently people come in just in the past few months where they're like, "I don't do anything in a session. I just call in the spirits and they do it." And it's like, okay, cool. I mean, because that's a, rightful method. Sure. Who do you call? Archangel Michael. Yeah. I mean, maybe. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying, for those of us that have been around this sort of community, industry, soul group, whatever you want to call it, long enough, everyone's going to be Archangel Michael at some point. I'm sorry if you're one of the people that's like, I love Archangel Michael. It's beautiful. Please hold on to that. Just remember, it's like you will see it when you open yourself with ears to hear and eyes to see. You'll see that pattern recognition and you'll know what I mean. And so, while that isn't always such a bad thing, I've seen it become very problematic for some, and you'll find it is a common form that imposter or trickster spirits will take just so they can gain access to human energy fields. So, for those new to all this, please take caution with any presence that shows up in your spiritual session as Archangel Michael. I'm not saying every single time you reach out to this energy, you will always receive an imposter, but after thousands, and I can definitively say thousands of these types of encounters, I cannot underestimate the importance of being fully aware of your intentions and who you are attempting to reach before just going before you just go trusting every spirit who claims it's an archangel. I read that awkwardly. I'm going to repeat it. It's, you know, sorry guys. I cannot underestimate the importance of being fully aware of your intentions and who you are attempting. I was saying it as if who you are. I'm not even reading my own text properly. Be fully aware of your intentions of who you're attempting to reach before you go in trusting any spirit that claims it's an archangel, because you will. That's going to happen for many, many people. I see it happen with channelers a lot when they're new. You'll see even the voice of the higher self, when sometimes spoken through the body, will have an easier time engaging in that process if we kind of remove our focus solely from the self and place it upon a spiritualized figure of guidance or assistance, you know what I mean, such as Archangel Michael. And so I'm not saying it's like a big problem, you know what I mean? Because some people are channeling their higher self in a very benevolent way, and they might identify it as that, but I digress. As I prepared for the clearing, Maureen and Christina sat behind me on a small brown couch against the wall of the room. I pulled up a folding chair and placed it in front of Jared, just to his right, as I often did in my own sessions. In fact, I would say if you're one of the people that has engaged with me in a private session face to face at any of the events that we've done, you'll notice that's how I operate. I'll put a chair next to someone, kind of angled toward the back of their ear, sort of like, you'll be sitting just behind them to the right or the left. It doesn't matter what side. Although I usually go to the right side, I've noticed, for physical placement, and then I turn to the left for connectivity, but that's probably too much needless information in the moment. So I pulled up a folding chair and placed it in front of Jared, just to his right, as I often did in my own sessions, so I could talk in his ear a bit easier. The entire green room was covered in what looked like super high quality golden brown colored wood paneling. It seemed a bit 1980s, and I'll pause there, maybe even 70s or 60s. My dating is horrible on that, but it was extremely, extremely well built. I mean, like really, really nice, like incredible wood paneling. You know what I mean? Like just real luxury shit, to where that was like, wow, you spent so much money rehabilitating this recording studio. It's shocking. It was also cool. In some ways, it was a big mistake as well. But anyway, the entire green room was covered in what looked like super high quality golden brown colored wood paneling. It seemed a bit 1980s, but it was still really luxurious and had the smell of new paint from all the renovation work going on. It looked like she had turned one of the little vocal recording rooms into a very small bathroom, and I could hear what sounded like the fan buzzing in the background. There were old piles of trendy fashion magazines and promotional materials for the store stacked to the left and right against the walls. You know what I mean? It was basically a room that was used as kind of, just like a green room meeting space when they weren't doing stuff with their studio, which would have been just to the right from where I was sitting. You know what I mean? I was sitting here, the guy that I was working with was sitting here, and in front of me across the wall was a very, like, this leather couch, and there was two women sitting there just like this on both sides facing me, the owner and Reverend Maureen. And so, getting back to it here, let's see, where were we? Right, so there were piles of old trendy fashion magazines and promotional materials for the store stacked to the left and right against the walls. I remember there's even, not that this needs to be said, but, there's even, like, packages of paper towels, you know what I mean, still in the packaging, and, like, toilet paper. It was just being used as a storage space in the moment. I had already developed a pretty standard system of opening up the energy body. Only a month or so earlier, I had had an out of body experience with a group of spectral, shamanic Zulu warriors that we spoke about in the previous chapters. And it had given me a whole new approach to energy clearing. So it's not that I was without tools of any kind, it's just that I had never encountered what I thought to be a truly possessed person. And while in reality, I didn't even know if that was actually the case, I definitely felt unready for this encounter. I also felt triggered by Maureen and Christina looking over my shoulder. Something about their energy and mannerisms made me feel like they were always sizing me up or comparing me against the few other males that had worked there. Honestly, there weren't too many, and most of them seemed somewhat predatory or completely emasculated in some way, that it was like they had either gone dark or had been tamed in some way by unnatural means. I was very much an anomaly and a spectacle to them. It sounds lame, but it's no exaggeration. A part of me wondered if this was some kind of a test in a way. And I'll pause there to say that's really, really what it was. It was almost like every man that worked there had been like somehow neutered in some kind of way. And I think that's common, in certain communities, depending on, your soul group or people that you associate with. And it's almost like the norm nowadays in certain circles. But I was very conscious of it there at that time. It was like all of the men were either gay or had been totally cucked in some way, where they were just like like this sort of like shrinking violet type of a thing, where and it was very weird for me because I was the opposite of that. And I'm not saying that my way was better, but I think that, in some way I was just much more direct, and I was way more, you know, just different in a lot of ways. And so after a very brief introduction between me and Jared, I began to gently move him into a state of mild hypnosis. For those that have read the previous chapters of this book, you may remember me talking about entering a theta state, quote unquote. This is the state of brainwave activity just above sleep and is often an excellent wavelength in which to do energy work because we can very effectively bypass the conscious mind and get straight to the heart of it all in a sense. I found when doing energy work, this is one of the most useful skills to have, as it will help you center a person in their energy and cause them to knowingly or unknowingly open up the doors in their energy field needed to actually elicit a true release of some kind of trapped energy. A very short way of saying that is I believe that learning to engage in hypnotic processes, hypnotic language, hypnotic scripting, hypnotic energy healing, I think that that is incredibly useful for those that engage in any kind of spiritual work as a practitioner or any sort of, healing, professions, especially when it comes to doing spiritual work. If you can ease someone into a state of receptivity through hypnosis, the work that you're doing will go so much deeper. And what's crazy is I've heard people saying that that's somehow wrong. I've literally watched entire shows of people on YouTube where they believe that engaging in any form of hypnotic energy work is like sacrilege and absolute evil. And it's like, what? And I remember hearing their reasoning for that was that you were bypassing the conscious mind and tricking people into thinking that something had changed. And while some would say that is technically possible, there is a boundary that occurs within any hypnotic session or hypnotic working in which people will not do things that are fundamentally against their framework or their makeup or their belief systems. And I think that we've been tricked as a community into thinking that those who engage in hypnosis have some all powerful command over people and they can just cause you to believe certain things. And while in some ways that is possible, I think it gets a bad rap. And I think also it's one of the most powerful skills that you can use. Um, Absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Anyway, before I get stuck on that rant there, so I started to kind of ease him into, this hypnosis thing. I was sitting there watching these two women staring at me. I remember being, this is needless, too much information. I remember being very conscious of my breath in those moments. For some reason, it was as if somebody was telling me, don't breathe too heavily upon this person. It will affect the balance of energy present in this moment. I remember something very along those lines. It was like, watch your breath. I still don't know why, but let us continue. After a short induction process where I would speak rhythmically and softly into the side of their head behind the ears, I would then have them breathe with me in sets of three. For those of you guys out there that hang out with us in Patreon, if you do private sessions with me, you're going to be like, oh God, there it is. He does this thing. Matthew always does this thing where he does 3, 2, 1, and you breathe in. And yes, we still do it to this very day. And that's where I started doing it, was at that store. As a result of just stuff I was doing, I was shown, I was like, you can synchronize thought forms, you can synchronize heartbeat, you can synchronize respiration and the vibration of people's energy fields by creating this rhythm that you engage in together. And so that's why we do the 3, 2, 1 breathe in thing. And this was right when I started doing that. This was like, it was almost like an organic thing. And on that day, I was like, okay, we're going to do it. And so it's a process I still use to this very day due to how effective and effortless it is for some to lock into. Not everyone, but most people, 60%. It's pretty good. There's other tools to help people open up from other directions, but that's just one of the tried and true ones. Um, we can talk more about those techniques another time if you're a person that is interested in such things. And so um, here we go. Let me get back to it. So yeah, I would have them breathe in with me in sets of three, a process I still use to this very day due to how effective and effortless it is for some to lock into. After the breathing process, which is essentially a deepener in the world of hypnotherapy, we would then often enter a short stage of question and answer in an attempt to discern what may be going on within the individual. I had only been using this process for just a month or so at this point in my life, and in truth, I really had little idea of what to do until after opening some door inside my mind, a piece of me seemed to check out, and another one would come in. I have often said to those who know me, if you knew how much I did on pure intuition alone, you would either be deeply impressed or seriously concerned. What I mean by that is that it was just a state of pure trust with no knowing whatsoever. You just give up and let go. I've said that phrase a lot over the years, and honestly, it is the absolute truth of my life. If people knew the extent of everything that I did on pure intuition, they would either be impressed or honestly, you'd be frightened. You'd be like, oh God, really? Oh shit. And yet we keep getting it right. So I'm like, thank you, whoever it is that's still working with us after all this time. And so, but I mean, that was it. And I think that was the standard of the real early stage readings that I would do. For those of you guys that remember the previous chapter where I talked about how I had gone to the interview to work at that store, and it was literally the first official tarot reading I had ever done, was there in that moment. And it was very much exactly what I said. It was like I had been trained through the work that I had done years prior in working with the theta state, not having any idea why I would be using it in the years later. I had no idea what I was going to be doing with it, later on. In the beginning, it was just a cool self-hypnosis program that I was into. And it's funny because as that progressed and stayed with me, that really, really became like a whole system and a whole process. And anyway, I don't want to get too far off into the commentary, but so yeah, I had only been using this for about a month or so, and very much it was like a piece of me would check out and another one would come in. And so after a minute or two of breathing with Jared and helping him ease into silence within himself, something very strange happened that I had never encountered before. I have to admit, it seemed theatrical at first, but he began to whimper and cry and like almost growl at the same time in a very animalistic manner, the way an old wounded dog might do. An incredibly powerful sense of fear seemed to come out of him that I could actually smell. In fact, if I had to name it, it was like the smell of old blood, alcohol, and human sweat. Sickly, sweet, pungent, nasty in a very distinct way. It was weird. I didn't write this in the book, but that was, or maybe I did. This might be another redundancy here, but in looking back at that moment, it was like I was going through this breathing thing with him, and I would just sit with him, and then I would do 3, 2, 1 again, and we would breathe. And then and at that stage, I did it many more times in a row. I would have them breathe into each chakra. I would go, okay, now we're going to breathe into your heart. 3, 2, 1. And we would breathe through these places. And it was like after a little while of doing that, it was like first he went quiet, and then he sort of put his head down. And then he started doing this thing, which is cheesy that I'm going to do a reenactment of it here, but it was like he had his head down and he started going and doing this sort of like, it was almost like a weep. He was weeping and laughing at the same time. And it was like this like, like his whole body was like shuddering and like, and he started like sounding as if he was squeezing something with his voice. He started doing this like this groaning, and then he was like laugh and cry, and then this like groaning thing. And I want to be 100% totally open about the fact that I was scared shitless at this point. I was not in the I'm a cool savior. I was not in I'm a shaman. I was not in the power of Christ compels you. It was not that in any way, shape, or form. I was like, in that moment, I was like, oh shit. Okay, here we go. And it was like, oh man, something became very, very real. I have to admit, I was more confused by this than negatively affected. A part of me thought this was just another spiritual performance, like I had become accustomed to witnessing in that place. Yet at the same time, I felt my body shaking in an involuntary manner. And as I looked over my shoulder at the two women behind me, I saw their eyes like wide, like they were sitting there like just frozen. And I was like, I remember I was even looking at them like, what do I, that moment where you're like, holy shit, what do I do? And everyone shares a glance of like, fuck, you know what I mean? Something just got really, really, really real. I felt my body shaking in an involuntary manner. And as I looked over my shoulder at the two women behind me, I saw their eyes wide open with awe and fear. I began a process of speaking to the spirit inside him. In fact, I actually said that very thing. It is part of an approach I used at the time to try and speak directly to the entity inside a person. And I want to correct that here for the book. The real origin point of the question and answer dialogue hypnosis stage that I used to do with people was actually for the purpose of talking to the higher self. It was for the purpose of helping a person open up and to be able to speak to their needs and through the spiritual filters and the energies that are contained within the body. It was never intended to be I'm going to use this method to speak with entities. It was nothing. It was nothing like that. But it was like it was a long period of hypnotic deepening and then a question and answer session. And I said, I'm speaking to the spirit within Jared, I said, and began to question him in a non-confrontational yet firm way. I asked it to identify itself, which let me say very quickly, in my experience, this is not actually a necessity when clearing entities. There is an over-reliance on what many see in movies about how these things work. And in the years since, I've discovered that the idea that you must know the name of the entity to cast it out is pure hogwash. There is also an old belief that says if you ask them 3 times in a row, they're bound by some kind of cosmic law to tell you the truth. This is utterly and completely false. And once you actually find yourself in those situations, you will be very ill equipped to actually deal with the thing, because in many cases, they can only lie and they will only lie. And I'm not saying this in every single case, but this is the nature of when you do begin encountering what some would call lower fourth density spirits, entities, archons, even demonic forms, which is a very, very catch-all term for a whole host of very, very interesting and potentially dangerous and also highly evil beings. You know what I mean? So, a demon to some people is going to be something else to another person. But I just think it's really important to say that, because I still hear people talk about this on shows. They're like, I had to, you have to get it to identify itself. Ask them 3 times. You're going to ask them 3,000 times in a row, and you'll get a million different answers every single time. There's no need to positively identify. And I think that's such a Hollywood myth. Just as is they suddenly climbed up the wall, just as is, they started, well, no, languages do happen. The languages absolutely happen. But just the Hollywood theatrics of it, you know what I mean? There is no force that's going to open up all of your cabinets and closets to show you that there's a haunting. You know what I mean? These are just things that we picked up from Hollywood and then we applied them to real life. And the thing is that those that have actually experienced them, those that have really come into true contact with those beings, oftentimes you never hear of them. You know what I mean? Because they have no interest in repeating or telling that story through some Hollywood movie. It's only the people that have this need to be some kind of a performer, to need to prove to the world that they have some otherworldly set of skills, when the reality is, even within that deliverance moment, or if you want to call it an exorcism, for those that know, you will know that ultimately it's not you that's doing it. We're just holding space. We're holding space. And in some cases, we are guiding the process. But let me get back to it. So don't get caught up in the need to identify. Don't play I tell you 3 times and I ask you 3 times, you tell me the truth game. It'll go nowhere. In some cases, an entity won't even have an actual name, and they will constantly throw out a series of names, identities, archangels, even biblical demons. The list goes on and on. What's even crazier is that the really advanced, fully formed sentient beings that can also inhabit a human body, under the right conditions, will even pull names out of your own past experiences and feed them back to you. It is a truly bizarre phenomenon that is only designed to deceive and can cause many issues for those who are overconfident due to watching too many Hollywood horror movies. That is not at all how it works. So I'm going to tell you straight up, when you watch these guys on other podcasts and they're like, and I questioned the demon and it told me its name and I cast it out, while possible, in most cases, these are people that are speaking from very, very limited and very low level experience. And in many cases, they're highly exaggerating what has gone on. It's not to say that you won't get a name. It's not to say that there is no calling card, but some of the most advanced entities, there is no name. There's no calling card. Just like one of the great myths of the starseed world is, that some alien extraterrestrial being is going to come in and go, hey, what's up? I'm from the Pleiades. You know what I mean? This is not, in my experience, after all these years, I feel that I can definitively say that is not a pattern that I have witnessed or seen, both from my clients or from other people. People with a great over-reliance upon labels and names and calling cards, that's a whole other issue altogether. But anyway, let me get back to the matter at hand. And so, in many situations, you will instead be dealing with astral parasites, quote unquote, that greatly influence a person. And in even more cases, the entity will actually be a piece of that person's shadow, meaning an aspect of self that has metastasized or splintered off into something that seems to have an identity of its own. We see this quite often with individuals with dissociative identity disorder, or even those who have been subjected to trauma based mind control. These things are all absolutely possible, but in truth, I did not know this at the time. And it has taken me thousands of sessions in the years since to put this all together. Of course, others may differ depending on your own personal approach. Maybe your own experiences were different than mine. That's very, very fair. You might have encountered an individual and gone through a little an elaborate, energy clearing process with them, and maybe they identified themselves to you as Satan, and maybe you believed it, and that's fine. It's I'll be real, it's almost irrelevant. Like, which sounds to some people jaded, to some people it sounds realistic, but I think it's universal that when you do this work long enough, or you'll see that with people who have done this work long enough, whether it's like, I don't really care what the name is. You don't you stop asking. You know what I mean? It's kind of like a lot of those guys that spend a lot of time in the service as trigger pullers overseas, in Iraq, or people that were in the real war. You're like, what kind of gun did you carry? They're like, it's just a tool, man. You know, it's just, it's not like a personality that I'm carrying. You know what I mean? These were tools, these were methods, these were moments of experience. And I've just never known it to be of grave importance. That day could come. It could very well come, but until then, that's how we see it. And so, anyway, of course, others may differ depending on your own approach, but this is merely what I have discovered. In fact, I'll say one last thing before I go on. I've just noticed the more clinically I approach things at this point, which will sound stupid and cheesy and similar to the way, a doctor or a surgeon might approach something, is it's like a mass that needs to be removed from the body. I don't spend time pondering upon, the emotional content of the being that is, attached to the person. I don't spend time trying to identify it, or go through this elaborate method of understanding the spiritual terms behind what it's doing. You treat it from a clinical perspective, and it's like cutting a mass out of a body. It's like, well, that's a tumor. What are we going to do? We're going to cut it out. You don't spend time, talking to the tumor afterward and trying to understand it, right? You don't. You might analyze it, look at it, notice what it's made up of, make changes based on that. You know what I mean? Some of you guys will know what I'm saying, but as I begin to question and probe this entity, get ready for a twist. It actually gave me a name. I do not know exactly what it was now, but which is an odd thing. You think I would have remembered it given how insane this was about to get. But in truth, I really am not sure anymore. Although I do remember now, it was the Admiral. I called it the Captain. Anyway, it had a name just like that. So I would have remembered it given how insane this was about to get. But in truth, I'm really not sure anymore. Admiral. It was something like Randall or maybe Marshall, very human in a sense. What I do know is that it stated a rank. In this case, I believe it was captain. It was not captain, it was admiral. And I don't think this was ever a person that had been awarded the rank of admiral. It was just, that was the name that came through. That was what it wanted to call himself. It had the name of, well, I will get to the human element of it in a second. And so what I do know is that it stated a rank. In this case, I believe it was captain. As I began speaking to the captain, why was he here? What relationship did he have with Jared? What had happened that allowed him to enter this man's energy body? Now, I didn't explain this in the rest of the text here, but the first few questions that I asked, why was he here? What relationship did he have with Jared? Just for everyone's, we could say, building a picture of this moment. The first couple questions I asked of him, he didn't answer, and he just did this weird thing where he had his head down and he went like he was like gritting his teeth and something was trying to come out, but he was like trying to, something would sort of erupt from him. But once again, it was theatric and weird and sort of sickening at the same time. And there's like this smell that was like, anyway, let me get back to it. What had happened that allowed him to enter this man's energy body? I have to be honest, in knowing what I know now, I don't believe this level of questioning to be necessary in order to clear an entity, but I was unaware of this at the time and just kept going with it. You know what I mean? My best thinking at that stage was that, well, we're going to treat this like I saw in the movies. And I'm going to say, what are you doing here? How did you get here? What do you want? You know what I mean? I had this sort of firmness that I wanted to take with this individual. This approach, however, was not something this entity was interested in. And this is when something occurred that up until that moment I have only ever read about and seen in movies. Jared began to tremble intensely, and suddenly a strange, clear, fluid-like substance began to pour from his eyes, his mouth, his nose, his ears, mainly his mouth, mainly his nose, mainly his eyes. It was like in the front. And it was like this like literal weird stream of tears started going down his face, but it was not tears. It was like some sort of fluid was exiting this person's body, and it was sort of, anyway, I'm gonna stay with the text here so I don't get caught in this, and then I'll sort of describe it afterward. Jared began to tremble intensely, and suddenly a strange, clear, fluid-like substance began to pour from his mouth, eyes, nose, and maybe even his ears, but I was unable to really pinpoint it. And in truth, there was no time to explore this fluid as he began to growl like an actual animal. I heard Reverend Maureen over my right shoulder begin to pray out loud in a soft, trembling voice. I even looked over to Christina, and she just sat there frozen in a look of fear. I've heard this substance referred to as ectoplasm, but I do not know if that's what it was or if that is even something real. Honestly, it sounds like something from the movie Ghostbusters. What I do know is that I sat there with these two women behind me in this strange recording studio green room in the heart of Hollywood and watched some kind of spectral fluid pour out of this man's face. If there hadn't have been two other living, breathing humans sitting there with me, I would have never believed it. The captain continued to writhe and shake and growl like an animal, and for some reason, I put my hand on his shoulder and began to pray. I don't know what I said. It felt like the kind of praying a deliverance minister in the Old South would have done. The crazy thing is, I was not at the time, nor I am now, what I would consider a Christian. I mean, to tell you the truth, I had been raised in what I call a religiously addicted family, but it was not a frequency I considered using or bringing into my sessions. In fact, I did not and still do not call in any ascended masters, archangels, aliens, etc. into my sessions, even to this day, and I do not believe there is a need to, once you find the root cause or the bait signal inside of a person. That said, I do fully acknowledge the presence and power of invoking the name of Christ, Yeshua, Jesus, or whatever names you want to add to the mix. For some out there, that is all that is needed, and I believe it is important to admit this. As I placed my hand on Jared's shoulder and began to pray, many words came out of my mouth that I did not choose or understand or was even aware of. I recall using the toning frequency I had just begun to use, and in a short time, he began to speak again. After a few words, I could hear and feel Jared coming through in his own voice, and he felt in pain. It was like he switched from this weird growling, crying, like, it was like he was in pain and he had his head down, and that's what it was over and over again. He was just going, like over and over again. I know I'm doing a cheesy reenactment here so you guys can cringe in the background, but just so you know, that's what this man was doing. And there's like this stuff just like coming off of his face. After a few words, I could hear and feel Jared coming through in his own voice, and he felt in pain. He kept twisting his torso around and whimpering like a dog while trying to swallow something back down inside him. He kept doing this, like he kept trying to like force something down. I remember for a split second, I was like, he's gonna throw up. Here he goes. He's about to puke. But he kept like swallowing something like really, really thickly while whimpering like a dog, trying to swallow something back down inside him. The fluid kept pouring out and seemed to mix with his own tears and snot. But it's crazy because I could visibly see there were two different substances. One was clear like saliva or spit, and the other was kind of milky and almost like thick, drippy webs that flowed out of him. I recall asking him the same questions as before. Why are you here? What do you want? The captain, or in this case, the admiral, I'll call it the captain for the sake of this book. It's cool to be able to remember that, but the captain began to speak through Jared, and he stated he had been with this man's family for generation after generation. It had begun in World War I with Jared's great grandfather, and what he wanted was to drink, to feel, to be free, and to go home again in some way. He had been holding on to Jared in an attempt to experience the sensations of human depravity, addiction, and self destruction. I could still hear Reverend Maureen behind me praying continuously, and a part of me was grateful for that. As much as I had secretly despised her performative antics, she really knew how to hold space, and I believed her willingness to engage in that manner had a noticeable effect. In fact, in looking back, I believe she was vital to that moment. Had she not been there, something very different may have taken place. I began to realize at that moment that we were not dealing with an astral entity, a demon, Draco reptilian, anything like that. This was a disembodied spirit that had walked the earth plane in non-physical form since being killed as a human in the Great War nearly 100 years earlier. I do not remember the exact nature of our conversation, but I do know that we offered him forgiveness and asked him to move on. He expressed fear, anger. There was even a bit of howling and guttural sobbing, all the while this bizarre fluid seemed to pour out of him. And I mean, there can be no more real description other than that. It was like for a few moments in the midst of it, as I kept asking him, like, and what is it that you're seeking? How can I help you? How can we help you let go? How can we help you release? He started going and like doing this weird sort of howling kind of just this crazy vocalizations, man. I mean, even to this day, it's like a part of me still feels the sort of the fear, because there's, I mean, really, like for me, I think the overriding emotion within this experience was one of fear. I was afraid. I did not know how to act. I did not know what to say. I had bit off more than I could chew. And so there was a lot of fear, and there was also a lot of just very deliberate moments in which I'm sitting there going, what the fuck is this? Like, what is this? You know what I mean? Like, even still, the human element of you in that moment is like, really? Like, is this really, you know what I mean? Where you're like, this is really happening in front of me right now, isn't it? I do not remember the exact nature of our conversation, but I do know that we offered him forgiveness and asked him to move on. He expressed fear, anger. There was even a bit of howling and guttural sobbing, all the while this bizarre fluid seemed to pour out of him. I recall asking out loud to those benevolent spirits within that space to open a doorway, to show the captain how to leave this world with forgiveness and honor. And I remember that very specifically. It was like a declaration. I call on you now, those ancestors, those that care, those that are within this vicinity, open a doorway for him to relieve or to experience relief, to leave this world, whatever the language was. I don't know the exact words, but we explained that he would be rewarded for his bravery during the war, and all was forgiven in the name of the one infinite creator. Once again, I have to be honest, it wasn't actually me saying this, or at least that's how it felt. In those days, it was as if I would step back inside my body and this other version of me would show up that knew the right words to say. For those who know me, they will know I often stutter and stammer in many moments when trying to communicate. Even after 7 years of doing this work, I still have that issue, and it's well known. I mean, sometimes I can speak effortlessly. Other times it's very, very difficult for me. I would simply let go. It was as if there was this other version of me, a more polished, more determined, more articulate version would come in and say what needed to be said. I recall that day as being one of the most clear examples of this phenomenon. Jared continued to speak and sob for a few moments longer, and then all of a sudden it was as if he began to dry heave and gag, letting out a series of guttural belches that looked like he was vomiting air out of his body. A few seconds later, he seemed to go mildly unconscious, and after a minute or two, he rubbed his eyes, straightened up, and started to wipe his face off. The strange fluid seemed to evaporate instantly, which is a wild thing to imagine, but had I not been sitting there with two other people, I would not believe this myself. I mean, it was one of those things. We all saw it. Even if we didn't know what it was, it had actually happened. And for once, I was not the only witness. I think it was Christina who reached over and handed him some tissue from a small basket that was at the foot of the couch. As he blew his nose, I looked back at both women, and we all just kind of looked at each other for a few seconds with no words. What could you even say? Nothing like this had taken place in my life before, and I had no idea it was even possible. You see things like this in movies and you think they could actually be, and you never think they could actually be real until the day you run into one face to face on the second floor of some corrupted spiritual store that had once been a trendy recording studio for rock stars back in the day. As much as I had resented the false light posturing and ego games there, I was in a stage that had become more real than anything I had thought possible. It happened exactly where and when it was meant to. And in looking back, I'm deeply grateful to have been able to participate in that moment. Even if it was some other version of me or even some other spirit, just like what was inside Jared. Regardless of who, what, or how it took place, something actually happened. And when we were done, it was even as if the room had gotten brighter in some way. After a few more minutes, I remember going downstairs and getting a bottle of water out of some huge fridge they had down there. I didn't know how to react and felt oddly disconnected, somehow still very present at the same time. Maybe it was the more human version of me coming back into the forefront. I truly do not know. I don't really remember the rest of that day, but I'm pretty sure I just returned to my little room at the other location and went back to work. I didn't really know what else to do. And I'm going to pause there and we're going to check some of your questions. Thank you. This is a very long chapter, as are many of the chapters in this book. But let me know if you have any questions about this. I'm going to scroll through and see what everyone has to say. What's up, Cricket? I watched the Super Bowl halftime, then cried for 30 minutes, seeing humanity gathering arms and going to war, then asked humanity to stop this war. Had a vision of beings putting down swords and hugging. Maybe that will happen in this world. Maybe it will. It's entirely possible. Aurora Diamond Heart says, oh man, makes me think of Rick and Morty episode where his family had to send Morty to go get him to throw up a space parasite. I did not see that episode, but it was real gagging. It was a bizarre, disgusting, deeply vulnerable, yet meaningful and really bizarre moment in this world. I mean, that's why it's in this book. It's like one of the top 10 weirdest shit that's ever gone on in my life. You know what I mean? It's like, it's one of the only times, honestly, no, there's a couple others, but it was one of the only times where I was like, this happened. There was people there. They were there watching it with me. There wasn't just me telling, hey guys, this crazy thing happened. It was them and I together noticing and like being there within this. And so I'm going to scan through, see if there's any comments. Uncle Creepy says, is forgiveness and love the only way to send them back or dispel them? I don't know. Maybe there's other ways. Maybe there's other methods. Maybe there's grave spiritual power and commanding spirits. I don't know. I know that the way that has worked for me up until this point and what worked in this moment was forgiveness. It was forgiveness, love, and unconditional acceptance for the path that we have walked. And I would say also the willingness to say, desire this to be over, you know? And so anyway, I hope that makes sense. Okay. We're going to continue. We're just going to go through the rest, a couple more paragraphs. I don't know if we'll get through the whole chapter today because, my Lord, it is a long one, but okay. Let us continue. Actually, real quick, let's see. How long is this? Oh, my God. Actually, yes, we can get through it. We're going to get through it. So, to set the stage, we had just gone through this process with this guy, Jared. I remember I cried a lot too. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I cried a lot with him. It was like I didn't write about this, but like after that moment, like after this prayer thing that we did, it was like I just started crying as well. And it was just a very, very strange moment, in which like you're crying, this guy's crying, there's people there going, and all of a sudden everyone feels better and you're like, I don't know how this happened or what happened, but that's literally what it was. And I was just sitting there like, oh shit. Oh my God. You're just trying to come back down, and that was right before I went out and got the water. And it was like, by the time I went down the stairs, it was like this weird sort of like wave had passed. It was like I had this moment of like visceral release. And I was like, okay, and I walked down the stairs and it was like everything went boom, like in this weird sort of calm. I wouldn't say overjoyed. It was like a blankness kind of overcame me, which some people would say negative, some people would say positive. It was just like this, and the world just kept going, which is strange. Strange compartmentalization for those with analytical minds. From what I recall, neither myself, Maureen, or Christina ever discussed that day again. I do remember telling some stories about it with others in the back room, but just like a lot of other things going on around that time, it only led to comparison and competition. And as soon as I would speak about it, someone else would attempt to chime in with a bigger, more theatrical story. I do recall feeling a strange camaraderie between myself and Reverend Maureen after that. It was like a small thread of respect had been formed between us on that day, and I think we got a little closer because of it. Like so many things that occurred around that time period, I had no time to really process it all and just kept rolling from one bizarre occurrence into the next. A part of me realizes this is one of many reasons why this book needed to be written. Otherwise, this all would have remained locked up inside me, and I know I am not the only one out there to have had experienced such things in this life. I don't know what happened to Jared after this. I returned back into my strange world at the other store, and the world kept on turning. A few months later, in summer of 2018, I was summoned back to the Hollywood store for some kind of special event. This is the fun part. I think Christina was trying to raise money to help continue one of her lawsuits or something like that. And they had invited all these practitioners to come by and do various meditations, presentations, and other stuff. It was kind of like a mini conference in a way. It was like they put on their own kind of version of a conference there. I was scheduled to do an ET contact meditation in the very same room where I had found the used condom months earlier. I'll pause there to say that it's funny to think that I did for 2 years straight every Friday this ET contact meditation publicly that people would come to. There was never a time when people didn't come, which was cool. I was like, well, thanks everybody. And it was weird the sort of experiences that took place there. I remember in one particular experience, this woman came to the meditation and she was like, "Is it okay if I bring my grandma? She doesn't speak any English. She's staying with me for a little while. Is it okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't care. Bring your grandma. I'm sure. Have her hang out." She's like, she doesn't understand. She doesn't believe in these things. She's just, she's just, and I was like, "Yeah, fine. I don't care. Bring grandma. She can just chill. I had no problem with it." And so we went through this like meditation. We just, I don't even know what the contact was. It was just always reaching out, connecting with the forces, the extraterrestrial beings that exist in our world, and allowing ourselves to have an experience within the framework of that seeking. And so it was funny because there was one time in particular where that woman brought her grandma, And that was on a Friday. That was on a Friday. And I remember they came back literally Monday afternoon. They came back in and she was all, "Excuse me." She wanted to talk to me. She was like, "Excuse me." She summons me over to her and her grandma. And she was like, after the meditation that I came to at your store, my grandma has been having experiences, and she was speaking in Spanish, which I understand certain parts of it. A lot of it I don't, which is weird because I spoke Spanish so easily as a child. But that's another story for another time. But basically, was what she was saying, that she had a visitation. She kept saying over and over she had some kind of a visitation. Something had showed up, and I remember saying, "Ask." I was like, "Can you ask her what did it look like? What did it feel like?" And she points over to the picture for the ET meditation on the wall, and she was like, kind of like that, but tall. And I was like, "What? Whoa, huh." So you didn't even really know why you're there. You don't believe why you're there. You don't even understand the language of like what's going on. And yet, just by going through this experience, you had some kind of a mind blowing thing that occurred for you days later. You had some form of a visitation or some form, and it was straight up. They came back to say this was real. She had an experience, and I was like, "Whoa, what a trip, man! What a trip!" The way I discerned it was that it was one of the very tall grays. You know what I mean? Anyway, so they were having this mini conference. You know what I mean? And it was. I was not too stoked about it, and I was gonna go do that contact meditation there. And it's funny because nowadays we have all these people doing CE5s and, like, you know what I mean, and doing singing bowls, and like, and all we did was just connect and breathe and open up. Kind of makes you wonder in a sense. Anyway, let's get back to it. Okay, where were we? Okay. I do not recall what happened to Jared. We went back to do sorry, I lost my place in my own book. Okay, there we go. I was scheduled to work in the very same room where yes, I had found that used condom the last time I was there. And I was like, this place is disgusting. I hated it. I was just like, what a fucking cesspool. I was not into it at all. You know what I mean? And sure, a lot of it was ego too. I'm going to be real. This was not a good day for me. I was full of anger and resentment. And I think in looking back, I was holding on to a lot of toxic energy from people I had been working with and had done sessions on at the time. This can and will happen to many of us who do this work. And it is one of the many reasons why self clearing practices are absolutely essential for those who wish to keep going safely in this line of work. As I was coming to the stage where I was learning hard and fast lessons about that stuff, and like a lot of things in my life, I had to go through a certain amount of pain by my own hand before I realized what needed to be done, which was very, very real. Some of us are forced to learn the hard way, for better or worse. I've been one of those people. That evening in particular, I decided to get really high. I smoked a ton of weed. I was like, I don't want to go there. Fuck this. And I sat in my car and just smoked like 4 bowls of weed in a row, where you just pound it and you're like, weed smokers out there know, those moments where you're like, damn, I need to inhale as much of this as I possibly can. So I did. I was in such a negative mindset. My frame of mind was so fucked. I was so angry. I was so bitter, far worse than I get these days. But there was a lot of hatred inside of me that day. That evening in particular, I decided to get really, really high and just show up completely stoned out of my mind so I could get through it all. Not that that was even such a bad idea. It was the reason why I was doing it. Pure avoidance, resentment, and pressurized emotions. It's really what it was. I recall walking up to the door of the Hollywood store, and they had this super fat bouncer looking guy there. He looked kind of like an alcoholic high school principal mixed with Santa Claus and an ex football player all rolled into one. I had seen him around both locations before and heard he was some kind of security person, although you could tell he had no skill other than pure size at his disposal. I remember looking at him hugging all the young girls and effeminate boys that work there and lifting them up off their feet one by one when he would come in. And I'll be real, I knew exactly what this guy was about. Like, I'm going to be real. And for those of you guys who can't tell what I'm getting at, dude, 100% pure predator energy, like the most pure predator energy that you can imagine. And one of those people where you're like, you guys don't see this? You don't. Oh my God. Okay. All right. Yeah, great. I mean, this guy was bad news. He was just like this creepy old dad guy. And he had this thing where he would give people a coin. And what's weird is he literally had coins made for him that had some kind of a sigil and an insignia on it. I never got to look at the coin very closely, but he would go up to these women and also the gay boys that work there, and he would be like, I have something for you. And he would do this thing where he would shake your hand and put the coin in your hand and pull you close to him and hug you and just kind of hug on people in this really, really forceful, predatory way. And I remember being like, whoa, damn, what the? And to be true, I was not the only one that noticed that. There was another guy that worked there who I didn't actually get along with very well. That just a big gay older man, very daddy teddy bear like. Who we had somewhat of a working relationship. We weren't that fond of each other, but I remember he saw that guy hugging them too, and he was like, "I know what he's all about." And I was like, "I know, dude. I know, right?" It was like we both agreed. I was like, "This is not the guy you want to have around your stores doing security." You know what I mean? This guy's a major liability. And so anyway, this huge guy, he's out there hugging everybody, giving them coins as an anchor thing to anchor his energy on them. And I think he would take them out to lunch and dinner. Just totally creepy guy. I had seen him around both locations before and heard he was some kind of security person, although you could tell he had no other skill than pure size at his disposal. I remember looking at him hugging all the young girls and effeminate boys that worked there and lifting them up off their feet one by one when he would come in, and I knew exactly what he was about. I wanted to find a reason to have problems with him so I could energetically attack him. For real, I'm being totally honest. I really did. I know that's a horrible thing to do, but I think it's important to talk about where we've been in our own self healing journey. Because if you don't take care of your own energy when you do this kind of work, you're going to find yourself slipping into and disastrous. Whoa. Did my screen go black for a second? Every now and then, the results can even be disastrous, but I'm grateful we never got to that extent. And I'll just expand upon that very, very briefly. This will happen to people within this line of work if you don't watch yourself, if you allow yourself to get pulled away, if you allow yourself to get completely overtaken by your resentments, if you never do any self work, if you just shut yourself off in a certain way and become this sponge that soaks up everyone else's negative energy, even if it's for the purpose of healing. If you don't learn how to clear that from yourself, it's like it'll awaken your most negative and evil tendencies. And there's going to be some people out there that watch this and they're going to say, no, it doesn't. That's not true. I defy that absolutely 100%. If you do not watch out, doing this line of work without self care will turn you into the thing that you fear the most. I'm being 100% real. And it was during a time where I was very angry. I was very negative. And I remember seeing that guy and I was like, this like give me a reason, bro. Give me one reason. I was in that stage where I was like, go ahead, try it. Try me. Like you're waiting for them to do something. Not that I knew what I would do to him. You know what I mean? The dude's like 300 pounds. Energetically, not that I knew what I would do to him either, but that was my frame of mind on that day when I was walking to that store to do an ET contact meditation. Now, most people would be like, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should pause. But I was like, dude, I got to go to work. So you're like, you smoke all this weed and just try to blank yourself out going in there. which was what I did. And so, I hated the guy. I was just, everyone except for me and another person knew he was a predator. And, you're just like, ugh. So as I walked up to the door, I saw this big guy standing right there, and I had tried to just squeeze past him, and walk in. You know how bouncers will stand in front of the door? I tried to like squeeze past and just squeeze in the door. In my mind, I work there. He wasn't going to block me from coming in, but of course, he physically stopped me by filling up the entire doorway, placing one hand out, and he sprayed some kind of horrible smelling herbal mist in my eyes and mouth. I'm pretty sure it was like some type of lavender shit, but it was like as soon as I walked up and tried to squeeze past me, he went and sprayed this spray on me. And it burned like alcohol. And my first words to him ever, this was the first time I ever spoke to this man ever. I was like, what the fuck, dude? I work here. He smiled in this slimy way, kind of like a 1980s era movie bully. And he said, get this. He said, I'm I'm Archangel Michael. Christina asked me to help keep this safe place or keep this place safe. And I remember like, oh my God, Archangel Michael, here we go. You know what I mean? It was that moment where I'm like, this guy sprays some stuff on my face. Honestly, it wasn't that horrible. I think it was like lavender herbal spray. And he wasn't, the truth be told, he was not doing it to me in a display of arrogance or anger. It was, I have to be honest about that. He was smiling and very jovial, and he was like, psh, 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 like giggling in this silly sort of way. It was me that made it like confrontational and like, you know what I mean? I was turning it that way. And so he sprays this stuff in my face. I cussed at him, and he smiled in this slimy way, kind of like a 1980s era movie bully, and said, I'm Archangel Michael. Christina asked me to keep this place safe, or something nearly identical to that. I couldn't believe he called himself Archangel Michael. It literally disgusted me. Instead of getting more aggressive, I slipped into sarcasm mode and said something like, thank you, Archangel Michael. I'm Archangel Matthew. I'm doing the meditation at 7. He said something like, oh, yeah, I heard of you, as he kind of eased up and said something about how there were a lot of bad people and predators. He actually said, I want to correct that phrase, because in the time since writing this, I remember his exact words. He was like, you got to watch out. There's a lot of bad actors around here. And I was like, yeah, I know, dude. The fucking city's full of them. And so, he made this cheesy statement to me, and, told me I should keep my eyes open. I think he said something like, come and find me if I have any problems. You know what I mean? He was trying to even put me under his service. Like, I'll help you out, bro. You let me know, that sort of mannerism. And, told me to keep my eyes open. His words felt diluted and empty. I could tell immediately he didn't like me either, and he was actually the one they needed to be worried about. But he seemed so thick-headed that he accepted what I said and stepped inside. I mean, it was like one of those people that you realize you're like, oh, you're the dumb giant. You don't even realize I was just making fun of you. Anyway, you know what I mean? Just in the toxicity of the moment, you just kind of just breeze right through it. And so he was actually the one they needed to be worried about. Definitely. And so, anyway, I walked in and wiped my face off with my sleeve. I said in a bitterly sarcastic tone, what is that shit you have there? It smells great. He claimed it was some kind of clearing mist that he had made himself. In truth, it smelled like pure rubbing alcohol mixed with a tiny bit of lavender essential oil, but I played it off. In truth, I was a bit too high to really push this, and he could have squashed me like a bug if he wanted to. We had a very, very short exchange, and I actually thanked him in a passive-aggressive way for keeping them all so safe. I think I really did say something like, thank you. Thanks for really keeping this place safe. It was just one of those, I'm so glad you're here, moments. It was very much like that. He didn't really seem to pick up on that and looked a bit pleased by our exchange in the end. I walked away tasting this weird spray in my mouth and headed to the bathroom to wash my face off. Where were we? Oh yeah, there we go. I went to the bathroom to wash my face off. As I walked around to the back of the retail space on the first floor, I saw they had set up a huge stage. I mean, really, almost too big for the room. You had to squeeze around the sides of it to go to the bathroom. They had set up this huge stage, and Reverend Maureen was up there doing this oddly diluted light language transmission, which seemed like the same nonsensical gibberish phrases being repeated over and over. I was hoping she would drop 1,000 orbs of light on them all, but no such words were said. We did not get 1,000 orbs of light. We got like 30 minutes of like light language. Which is like, okay, cool. Anyway, I walked behind the stage and headed for the bathroom. And as I came out, there was a guy standing there waiting to come in. He looked at me with surprise and said, "Hey, Matthew, how's it going? How have you been?" He seemed overjoyed to see me. And I just looked at him dead in the face with this feeling of pure and utter annoyance. I was literally saying in my head, "Please just get the fuck away from me." I mean, really, I'm being 100% real. I was so angry. I was just like, dude, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you just please, please. That sort of moment where you're like, oh God, please don't do this to me right now. Like, I have no patience for this, which is not a good place to be, you guys. Everyone's been there at some point in your life. You know what I mean? He seemed overjoyed to see me, and I just looked at him dead in the face. And then that was when he blurted out something like, "It's me, Jared." I absolutely did not recognize him. He cut his hair and was wearing some kind of 1980s metal band shirt like Iron Maiden or something. I'm pretty sure it was actually an Iron Maiden shirt. He was wearing an Iron Maiden shirt. And I know that because I would always notice the Iron Maiden shirts because they always look so cool. And I was like, whoa. Never, forget that I've never listened to Iron Maiden, could not name one song, wouldn't even know if he played them. But for those of you guys that remember them t-shirt, metal shirt, black metal phase of the 90s, everyone had an Iron Maiden shirt. I remember he was wearing this Iron Maiden shirt and he looked completely different, years younger somehow. It was unbelievable. He told me that after that day, something changed in his life, and he had been sober from alcohol ever since. He thanked me over and over again, and I could feel his sincerity. I have to admit, it made me feel a bit ashamed for being so incredibly stoned in that moment, looking into the eyes of a guy who I had helped while somehow swimming in my own intense hatred at the same time. The strange thing is, meeting him in that moment really did lighten something up inside me. It really, really did. It was like those moments in life where you're trapped within yourself, within your own sense of self-hatred and just negativity. And it's not the kind that's going to kill you. It's just the kind that you carry everywhere and people notice it and see it. And sometimes you can relieve it. Sometimes you can't. And, I was gathering so much energy from people at that stage. And I think one of the things that I had not yet learned in 2018 was how to properly release all of it. And it was interesting because the strange thing is, meeting him in that moment really did lighten something up inside me. I could feel his gratitude, and he looked like he was doing really well. I can't deny it. Something really was different about him. A short time later, a number of people gathered into the little room in which I was going to hold the meditation. And even though I still felt a mild aggression inside of me, something had been lifted by seeing Jared again. I remember sitting down and attaching a little lapel microphone to the collar of my jacket. A woman was blowing bubbles through some kind of battery-powered bubble gun, and they had turned on this light system that made the entire room look like we were underwater with rainbow light all around us. It reminded me of the early days when I would awaken in the morning and watch myself coming out of a portal in the ceiling of my bedroom in San Diego, back when everything was simpler and more confused. It had only been a couple of years since then, but it already felt like a past life in a faraway world that no longer existed. I was on a different timeline now, but every once in a while I was still reminded of that period through the shafts of light that would still grace the corners of my mind. I looked around to see who had come in and saw Jared sitting there in the back with some woman. It somehow gave me peace. And when I looked down, I saw the back of the PA system speaker where I had previously found that used condom. Remember from earlier? It was obviously long gone now and had been replaced by multiple pieces of chewing gum that somebody had been sticking behind the speaker. Still gross, but somehow an acceptable alternative. I looked out of the open door as the room filled up, and I could see that Archangel Michael imposter guy out there circling the room like a hungry dog. I watched people filling in and was shocked at how many had turned up for this event. Filing in, rather, excuse me. I was shocked at how many had turned up for this event. That night, I simply held my breath until I dissociated into some other version of myself and facilitated a meditation that in the end seemed to have nothing to do with extraterrestrial contact, but was actually an energy clearing for myself that we all participated in. Afterwards, a bunch of people stood around asking me questions, and I felt very appreciated by them all, but also very separate from everyone and everything there. It was like there was an invisible layer in between myself and the rest of the world. Maybe there always was, and I was just noticing it at that moment. Later on, as I walked out of the store, I ran into Christina for a quick second, and she said something like, "Hey, so did you see Jared? He's doing so well now." I have no idea what I said, but as I walked out of the building, I could hear the roar of insanity on the streets of LA. It was oddly humid and just starting to rain. The pavement had already darkened from the raindrops, and I could smell the layers of urine and filth that often rose up like a toxic fragrance in those rare times of actual weather. I remember walking around the corner and getting a slice of pizza just before heading home. I felt like an alien in some way. I thought about Jared, that spirit inside him, and that weird fluid. I thought about how the women who witnessed it with me and how different we were from each other, but how we had all been somehow led there to be together during that strange moment in time. I could still smell a bit of that horrible spray and thought of that predatory Archangel Michael imposter, probably still circling the room looking for someone to hug and pick up off the ground helplessly. It was all so crazy and out of this world, yet it was what had actually happened, and I was living it every single day. I remember that night I actually forgot where my car was for a little while due to how high I had been. Seriously. I literally forgot where my car was. I'm just being real with everyone. I was like, where's my car? Even for a few seconds, I thought it got towed or stolen. I was like, where did I park? I started to kind of freak out a little bit. And, I kind of walked around for a while. I wandered around a bit, looking at the stars on Hollywood Boulevard as the rain was choked dry by the LA smog. I watched people going about their blind existences, chasing money and empty fame like some unattainable drug. I looked down an alleyway to my left and saw a group of homeless people putting up blue tarps over their torn street tents. Somehow, I was in a completely different world than they were, yet right there amidst it all. It was truly one of the best times of my entire life. And that is it. Really was actually one of the best times of my entire life. It's funny looking back on it now. One of the biggest takeaways that I have from the entire thing was that was one of my first lessons in understanding the level to which we can absorb the toxicity from the world and how it will sort of own you for a time, and how even though it does, there's still simple things and just the presence of people and the right order and the right timing. And it's like we have this ability to let go of everything and anything. And I think That's kind of what that experience showed me, and looking back at it, I was right where I was supposed to be, despite the toxicity, despite the posturing, despite the impossibility of all and everything that was going on, the truly nebulous nature to everything. And I remember that literally walking down that street, looking at those like just piss covered, Hollywood stars, stepping over people, passed out on the sidewalk. And I was like, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Boom. And it was very interesting. So, yeah, I still don't know if that was truly ectoplasm that came out of that man, but it was something out of this world, something that did not linger, something that left no residue, something that sort of effortlessly flowed in this way that I've never seen anything like it in this entire world. Not before, not since. I still don't know what it is. I don't think that that was a demon that we exorcised from that man. I think it was really just a spirit that had taken hold of him, that had been exacerbated by the negativity and the toxicity of that environment. And I guess at that stage of the journey, I was the one that was tasked with, coming in and helping to make sense of it all. And it was wild. It was an amazing experience. And so that said, we're gonna probably close it off in just a few minutes, but I want to thank everybody for being here. Let me know if you have any questions before we roll out of here. What's up, Ramy Salem? That's creep spray had a spell to make people like him. It might have. I was very intrigued by that guy and also very worried about him. And I think also because, just to be totally 100% honest, I think that also at the same time, he was the only other strong male energy that appeared there. Not to say that I was one, but it was something that I was aware of. It was like everyone around me had become so feminized, which isn't a bad thing. So please don't let me turn it into some kind of negativity. It was just a very strange observation. It was an environment in which masculinity was somewhat feared, and everyone had to adopt a certain type of formless sort of compliance, and one of those love and light only, everything else is evil type of environments. And it was just it was hard for me to deal with. um Not to say that it was always like that. That was just one of the elements of it. And I was very intrigued by this man. I noticed, like I said, he was giving people these coins as anchor objects and creating these herbal sprays, and it may have very well had an impact. But what I did notice was that about a month or so later, he disappeared. Maybe more than a month. I'll say a short time later after that, he disappeared. And I don't know what happened to him. I don't know where he went. It was like he was a wave that passed through, and then he was a wave that left. And to add a little bit more context to what happened after that experience, I never saw Jared again, other than that time that he showed up at the meditation. However, that was not the end of the problems they had at that store. In fact, I think it was kind of just the beginning. It was just getting started. Like there's so much more negativity went went on there that let's see, there was a comment that I was going to attach to it, but I actually forgot. I lost my train of thought of what I was going to say, but he was a very intriguing person, and I think a short time later, what something happened after that. I'm trying to remember what it was. A short time later, there was an event that completely eclipsed all of that, which I imagine we will be speaking about that in the next in the next chapter. Yeah, sorry. Um, anyway, Andromeda has a question. Thank you. When someone in their what do you call when someone in their dreams and sleeps gets easy to have ET contacts? What do we call? I'm not sure that we would necessarily call it anything. I'm not sure that there would necessarily be like a label or anything. I would say that's a person that is experiencing, some type of, dream time contact. You know what I mean? I don't know that we would put a label on it per se. I don't know if that answers your question in any way. It might not. But then again, maybe I fully didn't understand your question. That's also possible. But anyway, I feel like there was an additional layer of something I was supposed to convey before we go. Next week, we're going to be talking about reptilian collectives. It's also one of my favorite chapters of this entire book. So, next week, we're going to get weird in a very, very different manner, in a whole different way. A lot of people have had comments about this chapter over the years since. I think there's a lot of, I'll just say it, galactic racism that takes place toward, some of the reptilian beings in this world. And I am just not a believer that they're all negative and evil, but that's certainly a conversation for next week. And so we will be talking more about that next time. In the meantime, I want to thank everybody for being here. I don't see any other comments, but yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cricket. Such a powerful example of energy sovereignty. I wish I could say I identified it as that at the time. It was really just me going along with the way that I thought it was supposed to be, and I was just very aware of people like that, which honestly is a problem for me. I seem to have that ability where it's like if there is a predatory energy within the midst, I will sense it immediately. It's been like that since I was a mere child. It's just, it is what it is. I mean, it's just a thing. Some people will sense it. And, I could also say this is kind of a non sequitur, but that was right around that period of time where I realized that I could hear it, because you guys have heard me comment upon this if you've heard any of the shows I've done, or if you've hung out for this, these live streams, around that period of time in which we sort of helped release that spirit from, Jared and all that. That was right around the period where I realized that I could hear the organs inside people's voices. By organs, I mean, the balance of energy within the body. I could also hear people's chakras at that time, just within the sound of their voice. And it was like an undertone came in around that period of time that's still there to this day. In fact, it's far, far stronger. And I think the first ways that it showed up was when I could sense, this will sound ridiculous to some people, but there was people at that Hollywood store that I knew were on like drugs and all this, and I could literally tell you exactly what they were taking. I could smell their breath, and I could pinpoint it down to an actual substance. And I ended up getting it right time and time again. Adderall was one I was able to positively identify through the breath, as was benzodiazepines was one that it's like I could literally sense the essence of it when someone would be talking. And what's wild is it continues to this very day. To this very day, you still can. Anyway, the last thing I'm going to say before I get out of here, I realized we were right about to close it, but there was one other little piece that I wanted to throw on to the tail end of that story. Like I was saying, after that, after that strange exorcism process that, we went through there, I call it more of a deliverance. If you want to get technical, I feel as though it was a deliverance, quote unquote, moment rather than a real exorcism. But like I said, that was not the end. That was the beginning of their problems. And a short time later, they hired, check this out, a $5,000 a day private shaman to come into their store. Who in this world charges $5,000 a day? I still want to know who it was. I never got this man's name. They hired a $5,000 a day shaman to clear that store. And what do you think happened? Nothing. They did literally nothing. He didn't even help release a spirit. You know what I mean? It was like the dude did less than I did. And he got paid $5,000 just to show up there. And I remember hearing about his interview because it was the talk of the store. They're like, oh my God, they hired the shaman from Africa. He's gonna come in there. He's $5,000 and he's gonna figure out what's going on with the store, because they were losing money. People were just having all kinds of negative experiences, spiritual attacks. So much weird shit was happening there. We'll talk about it later in some of the other stories, but yeah, $5,000 a day. And what ended up happening was he actually interviewed everyone. He went through and interviewed all the employees. And I remember asking, like, what did they say? Like, what did he do? And his whole thing was he asked them really weird questions, like, who are you having sex with, and how often are you having intercourse, and what is your connection with this or that? And he was just like asking these bizarre, nonsensical questions. And the end result of his work was that he had identified one young girl who worked there. Just one young girl, she almost seemed like the youngest one that was there, very blonde-haired, kind of pure, uncorrupted type of energy, She hadn't been there long enough to get turned out by Hollywood, if you know what I mean. Very new in her path. And this $5,000 a day shaman somehow discerned that it was her energy, something attached to her. You know, like he chose the most attractive, youngest, freshest one, like that type of a thing where you're like, really? That one? Her, this girl? She's the cause of it. And so what he had her do was actually a somewhat of a ritualistic thing that has been shown. It's been used by many, many different practitioners over the years. And it is, with the right technique and the right processes, a way in which you can kind of trap in energy or remove an energy from the body. But what he told her was that, number one, she could not have sexual intercourse for 30 days. And in that period of time, every day she was to take a fresh egg and run it over her body from her neck all the way down to where, all the way down there, and then roll it all the way back up. How strange and specific of a process is that? It was very interesting in a way to be like, huh, that was his technique, huh? He wants you to take an egg. And I remember talking to her about it specifically. And she was like, he said I should take this egg and put it from here and roll it all the way down and then roll it all the way back up. And I was like, and what is this? What was that going to do? And, everyone was like, he's totally real. He's for real. He's the best. And I remember being like, what would that do? What does that do for you by rolling the egg from your genitals up to your throat and back again? What spiritual purpose does that have? And she was like, I don't know. And that was it. That was like the end of the story. And I was like, so you rub an egg on yourself and you're told not to have sexual intercourse for 30 days and all the negativity will be gone from this store. And it was like, yeah. And I just remember being like, you're just like, okay, I'm gonna go. Like what do you say about that? These were the type of people that we were operating with. You know what I mean? And so might add a little bit of an interesting twist to the whole thing, but it was like, wow, who in this world charges $5,000 a day? I want to know who he is. Cause I'm like, bro, you got a business model going on that is out of this world, man. Like I have never heard of such a thing. Maybe it was exaggerated. I don't know, but $5,000 a day. Anyway, thank you for joining us here today, everyone. These were the fun, wild, bizarre experiences that fortunately or unfortunately helped shape me into the strange, malformed being that you see here today. Yep, it's part of the process, how we became what we are now. That said, we have a couple things going on this weekend. If you're one of the few people that's hung out this long, we're going to be doing our monthly Patreon group meeting over in the Blue Flame Collective. Anybody can join. It is $10 this Saturday, the 14th, right? 13th or 14th at 4 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be doing, I don't know, maybe they're Valentine's Day readings. I don't know. But everyone that comes gets a reading. And so our regular monthly Patreon group meeting is this Saturday. You can find us over on Patreon at Blue Flame Collective. It is $10, but don't worry. Everybody gets a reading. And so that said, join us if you feel inclined. In the meantime, we will be back next week where we're going to be ranting about the reptilian collectives
In the meantime, thank you for hanging out with us, all those that have stayed this long. Please hit the like button. If you're one of those random people that doesn't know how you got to this recording and you're sitting there going, I don't know how I got to this weird shit, subscribe if you can. You'll help me greatly. One day we'll break through. But anyway, I love you guys. Thank you for hanging out with us. We're going to be back in exactly 1 week. In the meantime, stay out of trouble. You know what I mean? Yeah,